Originally, I wanted to showcase building this mantle in one single video. However, when I gathered all the footage, it totaled over 13 hours. I like to be thorough with my projects so you get all the information about it. Therefore, I'm going to split this mantle into two parts. This first part will show it being built, and the next part will show staining and mounting. If you haven't seen it already, I remodeled my fireplace from a bland red brick fireplace to a much more modern and exciting part of the house by building a custom surround, installing a bunch of decorative trim, putting shiplap on the walls, and painting it all clean white. The final piece of the puzzle is to build a custom mantle that will have a secret door to hold all the electronics and gaming consoles. For a few of my previous projects, such as the floating cat shelves and the bar cabinet, I used birch wood. I like the look of it and it's very durable. So, to continue the trend and make all the custom-built furniture in the house look similar, I'm using birch wood for the mantle. The first thing I did after bringing in the wood was choose which pieces to pair up. I got a few different widths based on the design of the mantle. The widest board I could get was 7.5 inches, and I needed a board about 13 inches wide, so that meant I'd be pairing two boards together. I had to do this for the bottom and the top of the mantle, as well as the front face and sides. The front face of it would only be 8.5 inches tall, so I paired two 5.5 inch boards together for that. First things first was to start gluing up the boards. I lined up the boards next to each other, marked each board on either side of the seam, and used a biscuit joiner to cut out neighboring slots. I decided to work on the garage floor because that's the flattest surface I have that's big enough to handle boards this size. I started with one side, put glue in the slots followed by the biscuits, then put glue on both board edges and put them together. It took a little bit of work to line up the biscuits and tap the boards flush together. When I was clamping them together, I realized that the clamps would work a bit better if the entire thing was raised off the ground, so I put a few 2x6 blocks underneath and finished clamping. I don't have nearly enough clamps to properly clamp up something like this, so I just did the best I could by spacing them out evenly. I let it sit 24 hours before undoing the clamps. This first glue up went pretty well. There was a bit of an arch across the seam that could be fixed later with sanding. I followed the same process again for the next pair. The nice thing about a biscuit joiner is that the edges are set at the same level and line up really nicely. I did one thing different with the glue up for this one, always trying to improve the process to make the end result better. In order to minimize that arch across the boards, I clamped 2x4 boards on the bottom and top of the planks to keep them flat. I used some of my smaller clamps for this and didn't lose any of the longer ones for the main clamping. The clamps really helped close up that seam. I also put down some extra glue on the seam so it could seep in and fill in any gaps. By the third and final glue up, I had the process down to a science. The only problem was that these boards were the most warped. Even though they weren't warped a ton, when you spread that over 8 feet, it makes lining up the boards a bit difficult. Both boards had a bit of an arch spread over the length of them, and in order to eliminate that arch, I flipped one to be a valley and the other to be a hill. In the end, it actually worked really well to counter the problem and make the pair really flat. The extra 2x4 clamping I'm sure really helped that as well. Here, you can see how well it worked. You can be the judge of my method, but with limited woodworking resources, I'd say it worked pretty well. Any of that slight curvature will be eliminated with the assembly. The mantle also has two sides with paired boards. Since they're so small, I paired a longer board to be cut in half. I made sure that there weren't biscuits anywhere near where the cut would be. That would be pretty bad to have a biscuit showing in the final product. I definitely had enough clamps for this little guy. Okay, all the pairing is done. Here are all the pieces of the mantle. The next step is to clean up all the boards. There was a bunch of extra glue at the seams, so I started with a chisel to chip away at the big chunks, trying my best not to take any wood with it. Then I hit it with an orbital sander, starting with 60 grit to knock down the rest of the glue and any of the labels. Then working up to 150 grit to continue working up to a smooth surface. This step is a really important part of the process. All the hard work in smoothing out the boards now just makes it that much easier to assemble later on, and will make the final product that much better. I'll sand it even more later, working up to 220 grit, but 150 is a good place for now. It was now time to trim up the boards to the correct width. I had to have my dimensions set because once I trim a board, there was no going back. I essentially maxed out my table saw with these cuts. My goal with trimming the boards was to have the seam perfectly centered. For good measure, I only trimmed up a board right before assembling it to prevent any mistakes. That way, I could remeasure before making any crucial cuts. I have a hand-me-down miter saw, but I also maxed that out while working on this mantle. I had to flip my board in order to fully cut the ends. First, I cut the end to make it clean and square. Then, I'd have a good edge to measure the length. This piece is the bottom of the mantle. I'll start the assembly with this and build on top of it. There was rain on the forecast, so I had to move quickly with my outside cuts. The next pieces are the back of the mantle. Since the section has to be clear for the outlets, I split the back into two pieces. Okay, the bottom and back pieces were ready for assembly, so I got started with that. Now, a word to the wise, always double check that when you're assembling things, make sure they're going in the correct places. I definitely didn't screw up putting this thing together, and I definitely didn't put the first piece on the wrong side. Yeah, I royally screwed up, and here's the exact moment I realized it. Oh no. Oh no, no, no. Luckily, I caught the mistake before any glue had set, so everything could be salvaged. But I was beating myself up the entire time. Because it had been nailed, it took quite a bit of elbow grease to pull the boards apart. I quickly put the correct board in that spot with a new layer of glue and finish nails. I used a few squares to make sure it sat at a perfect 90 degrees to the base. The worst part about fixing this problem was trying to get all the nails cleaned out. Most of the time, I just had to break the nails as close to the board as possible and hammer them down. When I was absolutely sure that I was correct, I put the other board in place, glued it, clamped it, and popped in some nails. Then I transferred the squares over to this new board. I let that whole thing sit overnight. This thing is a monster of a mantle. Next, I need to work on the dividers. This thing will be divided into 3 parts, with the dividers really helping to strengthen the structure. I needed to create some sort of cutout in the dividers to allow cables and whatnot to cross. So I cut out 2" by 2" squares in the back. This would be plenty of room for all the cables to run from one section to another. Once the pieces were ready, I was very particular about their location. The right and left sections had to be perfectly spaced and needed to create enough room for the gaming consoles. You can already see this thing starting to take shape. Once I was certain of their placement, I glued and nailed them into place. With these pieces, any excess glue was wiped away because it would be a bit trickier cleaning out glue from the inside corners. I still went through after and sanded the inside corners clean. I figured out now is a good time for a test fit to see how it was looking so far. It all fit really nicely, left a perfect amount of room for the outlets, fit inside the shiplap with room to spare, and would definitely be a good centerpiece of this entire remodel. I brought in the top piece before trimming it down to get a feel for how that'll look. So far, so good. Next, I worked on the side pieces. I had to be super particular with how I cut these pieces. The seam would not line up in the center. Instead, I would line it up with the seam of the front piece, which was slightly taller. Both side pieces were cut from the same glue up. Here, you can see the two seams that will line up, the front piece and the side piece. This will be the same on both sides. Once the first side piece was ready, I glued it and nailed it on. Unfortunately, the first nail I popped in split the wood near the edge. No! Since this side piece will be more visible than the other side of the mantle, I pulled it off and swapped it with the piece on the other side. Also, to avoid splitting the wood again, I used brad nails instead of finish nails. The smaller nail was less violent going in and was really only there to hold the wood in place until the glue dried. When installing the piece on the other side, I put the end with the split in the back to be as hidden as possible. I let all that sit overnight so the glue could cure and harden. The next day, I could install the top of the mantle. It was super important for it to lay completely flat, or else the final product would look skewed. I put it on blocks in the ground, and you can see that it has a bit of a bow to it right where the electrical outlet gap is at. I shimmed up one side to make it sit as flat as possible. When I put the top on, it'll hold everything sturdy in whatever position it's at. So if I install the top piece with a bow in the wood, it'll forever have a bow in the wood. And that's not good. Next, I could trim the ends of the top piece to fit. Just like some of the other pieces, this maxed out my saw's potential, and I had to flip it for a second pass on each side. I test fit the piece to make sure everything lined up correctly, which it did. Then I glued and nailed it in place. Every time I add another piece to this thing, it just looks better and better. The next thing to work on was cut the front piece to size. First, I cut the length. From the glue up, one end had a pretty tight seam, and also some really cool looking detail in the wood. The other side had a bit of a gap in the seam filled in with glue. To make it look as good as I could, I cut off as little of the good side as possible to keep the wood detail, and cut off as much of the bad side as I could to get rid of the gap. Either way, both ends needed to be cut to make clean, square edges. With the length cut to size, I could then slim down the other dimensions. It was important that the seam of this front piece lined up with the seams of the side pieces. This determined how much of either side needed to be cut. All the major saw work was finished, and now I could move on to the process of getting ready for stain. First things first was start sanding over the entire thing again. I hit every surface with 220 grit, and also smooth down the new seams. I also used the orbital sander to round over some of the edges and corners. I had planned for things to sit on top of the mantle, and I had to create a way for cables to cleanly pass through the top. For each section of the mantle, I used a Forstner bit to make an access port. Each hole was centered over its respective box, and all three were spaced evenly. Another thing that I had been trying to figure out was how to make an easy way to lower the door. I wanted it to be discreet, so a handle or knob was out of contention, and any finger holes would look ridiculous. So my solution was to route out a few angled slots on the top edge to act as finger grabs. I made 3 grabs, each one in line with the 3 holes on top. Okay, that's where I'll stop for now. In the next video, I'll show you how I stained it, sealed it, assembled the door, ran cables, and mounted the dang thing. Okay, that's it for now. See ya.